Good morning, and I'd like to thank you once again for joining us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. In October of 1971, John Lennon released probably one of the most iconic songs of all time. The song quickly rose to the top of the charts. It's a staple of Americana. And in the middle of that song, that anthem for peace, we hear the line, "You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one." I don't know whether you've thought about it or not, but he's right. You are a dreamer, and so am I. And I'm not talking about the dreams that wake us up in the middle of the night or those daydreams that kill our productivity. What I mean is that each one of us have dreams that motivate us, that shape our lives, that direct our decisions. You're a dreamer because you're made in the image of God. You were created to have your life hooked to something bigger than you are. You're created to have your life connected to the values, the plans, the hopes, the dreams of a greater kingdom than we could ever construct all by ourselves. You might remember back when I started this series that I mentioned we're calling it an X-rated sermon. Because if we seriously try to live out the words of Christ, this is going to be one of the most difficult and yet rewarding things we'll ever attempt in this life. I believe it was G.K. Chesterton who said, "The Christian idea has not been tried and found wanting, it's been tried and found difficult." Yet Jesus is calling us to chase after the heart of God. If you have had the privilege of growing up in the church, you've heard these words before. You've probably heard them your whole life. And you know firsthand that it's one thing to read the Sermon on the Mount and something entirely different to be a disciple of Jesus who's trying to live by these teachings. Jesus states that true happiness is found in being poor in the spirit rather than being proud. God blesses the meek. God blesses the merciful, the pure in heart. Jesus is trying to impress on us that the truly happy people in this world are the people who are striving to live against the grain of society. True happiness and fulfillment are found when we cherish the things of God more than we cherish the things of this world. Now, over the past few weeks, I've tried to get you to notice that the Beatitudes deal with our heart. They're describing the character of a disciple of Christ. And in the very next breath, Jesus is going to describe how our heart overflows into our actions. While we can fake an outward appearance or an outward character, we can only do that for a short time because eventually the truth of our heart always comes out. The reason Jesus begins the sermon with the Beatitudes is because he needs to lay this groundwork for everything else he's about to say. And because our Bibles have chapters and verses markings, it's kind of easy to separate the eighth beatitude from what Jesus says next about being salt and light. You see, if we're not careful, we're going to draw a line between the two, and we're going to miss what Jesus is actually saying. In the eighth beatitude, Jesus says, "We will be persecuted." And in the very next breath, Jesus describes how do we act? How do we respond to that persecution? Now, I want you to think for a moment how radical these metaphors Jesus is using actually are. Jesus says you are the salt of the earth and light. And usually when I hear somebody teach on this passage, they talk about how in pre-refrigeration days, salt was more than just a flavor enhancer. It was primarily a preservative that slowed the decay of food, that light drives away the darkness. And I think all of that's true. But what Jesus is calling us to here is something so much deeper by using these metaphors. First, this idea of salt and light show us what is fundamentally wrong with our community and where we've been called to minister. I want you to take just a moment and I want you to think about what's wrong with the city of Anniston or whatever city you're living in right now. What would you say is the biggest problem that faces your city? Let me suggest that our issues go much deeper than politics, much deeper than sociological or cultural or economic needs. The problem with my city and your city and every city is found in the hearts of the people that live in that city. You see, the problem with our cities is that our desire has gone bad. As sinners, we desire the things that we shouldn't desire. We want the things that we shouldn't want. We're moved by things that shouldn't move us. As broken people, we think about things that aren't really true, that are distorted, and that they don't look the way that life was meant to be looked at. Our problem in our communities, it's basically a heart problem. According to the Barna Research Group, 1 in 4 American adults claim to be a faithful, practicing Christian whose faith has a profound impact on their daily lives. Are you willing to say that our country and our communities are feeling the effect of over 50 million Christians who are being salt and light? Now, look, I'm not trying to be anybody's judge, and I don't want to be the jury, but I often wonder, do we have too much of the world in the church or too much of the church in the world? You see, the bride of Christ was created to make a difference in the world in spite of the persecution that we face. The church is supposed to make an impact on our society, not because we pass laws or we enforce the ones that we already have. We impact the society by our presence. The world needs light. The world needs salt. What it doesn't need is a whole lot of religious people gathering in a building for an hour a week talking about how thankful we are that we're not like our neighbors or our coworkers or that church that meets just down the street. Jesus calls us to follow him for the sake of the world. We are the light of the world. We are the salt of the world. Maybe some of these words in the Sermon on the Mount are really familiar to you. Maybe you're like me, and when you come to familiar words like this, you just kind of let your eyes pass right over them. You don't really let the words sink in and register and connect with how you're living your life. We get to these points and we go, yeah, okay, what else? But what I want you to really take a moment to do is to read verse 14 and notice that this is not a should be or a ought to be passage. It's saying you should be salt, you should be light. Actually, what Jesus is saying in these metaphors is he's identifying us as children of God, members of the body of Christ. Jesus is speaking identity over us. God doesn't tell us to go get some salt and share it. He says, you are salt. He doesn't say, go get light and shine it. He says, you are light. Jesus is pronouncing who we really are. The Jeremy Houck translation of the Greek would be, you and only you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world, a city set on a hill. This reminds me of one of the things that I get to do as a preacher. Occasionally somebody asks me to preach their wedding, and while I really enjoy doing the premarital counseling, I often struggle with the actual weddings. You see, I've seen too many family members or best friends show up to the wedding with all of their drama, and that makes weddings difficult. But in every wedding, there's this one moment that I love, and that's that time, that moment when I get to create something new by simply saying the words, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You see, before I say those 7 little words, they're not husband and wife. But when I say I now pronounce you, they are. They become husband and wife. Okay, that's a little facetious and I don't have that much power, but it does bring me a little bit of joy to know that I'm having a part in creating an ideal that these two people will hopefully live the rest of their lives trying to attain. You see, once I pronounce them husband and wife, this man and this woman will spend the rest of their lives trying to become what I just told them they were. He doesn't really know what it means to be a husband. She has no idea what it really means to be a wife. But once I say you're husband and wife, they're going to spend the rest of their lives trying to become what I pronounce them to be. In kind of the same way, these words of Christ, you are salt and you are light. Jesus doesn't say you ought to be salt. He doesn't say you should be light. He says you are. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And we're supposed to spend the rest of our lives trying to be what God declared that we are. You are salt, you are light. So it's time to get salty and it's time to be light. But Jesus says that there's a problem. You see, in the face of this persecution, we can make the bad decision to blend in with the world. And sometimes it happens so slowly that we have trouble recognizing when we've lost our effectiveness. Jesus says that if salt becomes bland and loses its saltiness, it's useless. It needs to be tossed out, thrown away, trampled on. The problem that I often face is, how do you know if salt loses its saltiness? I mean, it still looks good, it still has the same color, the same small grains, yet it never makes the impact it was intended to make. You might have noticed that the world doesn't really have a problem when Christians decide to do good works. I mean, sometimes they even celebrate the ministries and honor the people who live good moral lives. Christians can start hospitals to help the sick. We can dig wells in Africa to provide water to communities that have no water. We can build homeless shelters to help the disenfranchised people in our communities. We can start community gardens to feed the hungry or help tutor students after school. Christians, when we do these things, usually are cheered for our efforts and sometimes even given a certificate that's suitable for framing. People can even say that we're doing all of this in the name of Jesus, just as long as we don't talk about Jesus. You see, the problem is not that we're not being light. The problem is that we're hiding our light under a bowl, because the whole purpose of light is so that people will see the good things you do and will praise your Father in heaven. This call to be salt and light in our community stands in stark contrast to this false version of Christianity that just wants to fill our calendar with good works. We're never going to be persecuted for Jesus' sake as long as we neglect the call to be a disciple that loves God enough to go out and make disciples. We might win the world's applause, but at the end of the day, we've become salt that's lost its flavor. We've become a light that's been put under that bowl. Basically, God is calling us to evangelism. But we need to understand that making disciples is not just having somebody make this momentary decision. Evangelism strives for a change of heart, and we can't really settle for anything less than that. Jesus says that salt should never lose its flavor any more than light should lose its light. Salt is salty, light is light. How else can it be? Yet ironically, totally unexpected, sometimes you find salt without saltiness and light without light. Jesus is calling us to plant ourselves in the world, to invest in our community so that we can be the salt and we can be the light that Jesus pronounces us to be. Yet far too often we have two issues with this. First, we need to know, are we different enough from the world to make a difference in the world? God declared us to be light. Do we live in a way that pushes back the darkness? And secondly, is our light on a lampstand? Are we a city on a hill? Are we living in a way that makes people want to know what makes us so different from the world? If you've been around for very long, you've heard me mention Dan Loftus before. Dan had a profound impact on my family. My boys used to call him Dan the Good Time Man. Every time Dan saw my boys, he would give them $1 and he would talk with them about what they were going to see and what they were going to buy when they went to Disney World. And, it was never about the money. But he made this impression on my boys because he was one of the few adults that made them feel heard, made them feel important. He would show up after soccer practice with a couple of hamburgers or hot dogs and tell us, I figured that you were really busy tonight and you had to get home and cook supper, and the boys did their homework and got ready for bed. And I just wanted to help you out. So here's a couple of hamburgers and hot dogs. Dan did a lot of good work. He loved my family, but he loved lots of families. And you might be wondering, how is this evangelism? How is this being salt and light? Dan was just being nice. Jesus says, let your light shine before others. And then he's going to give us the purpose for why we're doing what we're doing. He says, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. You see, Dan wasn't just being nice. Dan had an agenda. He knew that people were watching him, and he was going to do whatever it took to shine his light, the light of Christ, in such a way that would help people recognize there is a God. Now, sometimes people were rude to him. Sometimes people told him they didn't want his help. Sometimes people reminded him of his own failures. Yet Dan was living in the world, And he was so salty and had such light that he never had to ask people to study the Bible with him. Usually what would happen was somebody would ask him, why did you fix my television for free? Or why did you come cut my grass? Or why did you bring food to this entire baseball team? Why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you living the way that you're living? What is it that makes you tick? And that's when Dan would tell them about Jesus. He would tell them about forgiveness and hope and family. This morning, as we go to the table and we look at the bread and we look into the cup, we once again get to hear Jesus say, you are salt, you are light. That's who you are. You are the people who transform the world by your very presence. This is not a call to perfection or something to make us feel guilty when we can't live up to the calling. This is just a reminder of who we are, of what our hearts were created to chase after. The bread reminds us that God added us to the body of Christ. The cup reminds us of the amazing depth of the love and the mercy and the grace of Jesus Christ. So as we gather at the table this morning, we need to consider a couple questions. First, we need to consider, do we believe the identity that Jesus speaks over us, that we are salt and light? Next, we need to ask ourselves, how do we move from being nice to being different enough from the world to make a difference in the world? And finally, we need to ask ourselves, are we living in a way that makes people want to know what makes us so different from the world? I guess the way that I want to end the sermon this morning is I want to look at you and I want to say that in the words of Christ, I now pronounce you salt and light. What we have to do is we have to live up to what we have already been called, what we have already been pronounced. So this morning, as you go to the table, and especially as you leave the table, you are salt, you are light. Let's go out and change the world because Jesus Christ has already changed our lives. You're loved. I hope you have a wonderful week, that you know how much you're missed, and I pray that you go in peace. Have a great day.